Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Someone wrote a national column suggesting that whomever we elect should at the very least be able to pass a basic high school test in American history. The fact is we all should be able to, if only because the past is prologue, because where we are as a nation and the problems and privileges we embrace today is a direct result of that history. Few have done more to help us understand our military history than my guest, Patrick O'Donnell. In his latest book, The Unknowns, Patrick takes us back 100 years to a story that, while unique to itself, represents the fundamental reverence we have as a nation for those that gave their last full measure of devotion. Patrick O'Donnell is a best-selling, critically acclaimed military historian. He's the author of 11 books, including Washington's Immortals, We Were One, and Dog Company, and he's the recipient of several national awards. He served as a combat historian in a Marine platoon during the Battle of Fallujah and provided historical consulting for the award-winning series Band of Brothers. It is my pleasure to welcome Patrick O'Donnell back to this program to talk about The Unknowns, the untold story of America's unknown soldier and World War I's most decorated heroes who brought him home. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure and an honor, Jeff, and we go back all the way to some of my first books. Thank you for that beautiful introduction.
Well, it's always great to have you here. I want to talk about how you came to this story, because certainly the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers is an attraction that draws millions of people in Washington, D.C. The changing of the guard at the tomb is one of the most reverent events, and yet it has gotten very little attention over the years in terms of really understanding its place in history. Talk a little about that.
It's history hidden in plain sight, and for me, all the books that I've ever written have found me in one way or another, and that's certainly the case with The Unknowns. I was given the honor and privilege to lead a guided tour for the Marine Corps in France, first for the 5th Marines, and then later for the Wounded Warrior Regiment. And we walked through Normandy first, the St. Mary Galise, Pointe du Hoc, Omaha Beach, and then we came back to the great and epic battle that the Marine Corps fought in World War I, the Battle of Belleau Wood. And as we walked through the shell craters of Belleau Wood, some of them that literally swallow a small house, there's mustard gas still entombed in some of the hardwood trees. It was this kind of accidental serendipity where I found out that the first Medal of Honor recipient for the Marine Corps, Ernest A. Jansen, saved Hill 142. And as we were walking Hill 142, it was uncovered that he was a body bearer for the unknown soldier that General Pershing personally selected. And at that point, every one of my books is defined me, but also is about curiosity. I wanted to know who the other men were. And that's the story that I uncovered. And it was history in plain sight. It was about the tomb, which is really an unknown story, and how it came about and the approach on the selection. And it's also about those men, these 8 men, as well as Edward Younger, who selected the body, the tomb, the unknown soldier itself. The whole thing was, I found out it was a story about the American Expeditionary Force. Each one of these men was selected to tell a part of that story in the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, as well as each service specialization, everything from the cavalry, the field artillery, combat engineers, even mounted troops, cavalry, heavy guns, the rail guns. And this is the story that's wrapped inside of, it's multiple stories wrapped inside of The Unknowns. It tells the story of the entire Expeditionary Force. It's a band of brothers. It follows the 49th Company of the Marines, which is Jansen's company through the entire war. In some of the most epic battles of World War I, Battle of Belleau Wood, for instance, Battle of Blanc-Mont, which nobody's ever heard of. It's an impregnable fortress that the French couldn't take for 3 years. And the 49th and the 2nd Division took it in 2 days. It's also the untold story of the tomb itself. And it's all of these stories kind of wrapped into one, and it's told very cinematically.
Talk a little bit about Pershing's selection of these 8 men and whether or not he really thought through this representation that you're talking about, or it was really just one of those coincidences of history.
It was the Army, there was direction from him from the top to select 8 men from each of the 3 service branches at the time, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And then within that, each branch selected what they considered their best candidates. And then General Pershing had the final selection itself. And he knew several of these men. The book is about men. Many of these men were the most decorated men in the American Expeditionary Force. For instance, Samuel Woodville was considered by Pershing, who Pershing knew Woodville quite well, to be one of the greatest soldiers of the American Expeditionary Forces. And he had, it's an extraordinary story. He took out 3 machine gun nests single-handedly. He could kill the man in hand-to-hand combat with a pickaxe. Pershing wanted that, but then they also had sort of physical characteristics. They wanted people that were 6 feet high, so they looked good, if you will. But it was really more about the story. And each one of these stories tells an extraordinary aspect of the American Expeditionary Forces. It's not just the guys in the trenches, it's also the Navy. For instance, James Delaney was a naval gunner, gunner's mate on board a merchant ship that fought a U-boat for several hours in a running deck gun battle, it's an amazing story that could be a movie. And then Delaney was actually captured alive with 6 of his other fellow crew members, including the captain of the USS Campana. And if you've ever seen the movie Das Boat, that's what it reminds me of, because they have to endure depth charge attacks. They go through a minefield. They encounter what's known as a Q ship, which is an Allied raider that was disguised as a merchant ship that suddenly, when the U-boat surfaced, hidden guns would appear and try to take out the U-boat. And it's all within the sweaty confines of a U-boat, which, is operating under the sea. And there's literally, condensation that forms inside the boat. And these men are getting what's known as U-boat sweat that literally gets on their clothes and all their food, the oil and grease from the engines inside of this dirty, small chamber within the U-boat. And the book really sort of, The Unknowns, takes you into that place, which is an unknown story.
Did those that were selected understand immediately the honor that was being bestowed on them?
Absolutely. Each one of these men, this was an amazingly big deal. And the unknown itself was the ceremony for the unknown was the largest ceremony of its time for 1921, and it was looked upon as to really sort of do many things, including act as a sort of national healing for multiple areas. It was a chance to provide some closure for all of those who had lost loved ones. There's about 116,000 combat deaths that America sustained in World War I. And the tomb is a national symbol to represent all of those who had fallen for America through the years from the Revolution forward. And this was a chance to provide some level of closure for those who had lost loved ones, and to actually also honor those who had served in World War I. But they looked at it in a way sort of to heal some of the national wounds that had taken place. And for many, many decades, we had fought the American Indian. And one of our body bearers in the book, Thomas Saunders, is a Native American. An extraordinary story and soldier who was given some of the toughest combat assignments. The Native Americans were put out front as scouts in most cases, or in Saunders' case, he had to breach the wire. He was only given a pair of handheld wire cutters, and his job was to breach a hole or put a hole through mountains and mountains of barbed wire so that the infantry could advance. And he would go across no man's land under a sniper and machine gun fire as well as artillery fire, and get to the wire and make an opening for the infantry to go through. But Saunders also penetrated so far into no man's land and into enemy territory that he was able to single-handedly capture over 60 German soldiers. And he had many other exploits that he was decorated for. He was there, but the last person I think that was really quite interesting that actually said some words in the ceremony for the unknown soldier was Chief Plentyclews, who was a Native American war chief. And he, basically discusses his, the role of Native Americans and how they had fought the white man. But he looks at it as a great privilege to sort of, in some way, in a small way, maybe heal some of those wounds. And he places his war bonnet with feathers that he had earned from, many acts of bravery, as well as a war staff on top of the grave as the body is lowered into the ground. And there's soil that's placed from France that's brought over and it's placed inside the tomb itself.
Tell us how the soldier was selected, because that's a powerful story.
It's an incredibly powerful story, and the book follows each of these 8 body bearers, as well as Edward F. Younger, who's a regular doughboy with the 9th Infantry Regiment, which is part of the 2nd Division, which is part of what the Marine Corps was attached to. And the 2nd Division is an elite unit in many ways. It fights in some of the greatest battles of the war. And Edward Younger is a participant in this carnage and, goes through and faces hell, goes over the top multiple times in some of the most difficult combat. And, survives the war, even though he was wounded twice, very severely. But he is present in Germany, part of the occupation in 1921. And it's 1921, and the United States has decided to select an unknown soldier. This is not it's not an American idea. France and England are the first to actually choose an unknown soldier. And what happens is, the United States has about 2,200 unknowns, individuals, soldiers that were unidentified because their remains were so torn apart by, in many cases, the high explosive artillery shells. A movement begins in the United States to also honor our unknowns, to sort of bring closure to those battle deaths and honor all of those who had served. And a popular, a woman from an editor from a woman's magazine, The Delineator, Marie Maloney, decides to write a letter to the War Department and insist that we do the same thing that the French and English are doing. Initially, it gets nowhere, but the War Department starts to begin to agree with her, and then there's a movement in the United States. The New York Times, AP, and others begin to sort of come around her idea. And Hamilton Fish, from a captain who was in the Harlem Hellfighters, this was a segregated African-American and Puerto Rican-American unit that fought from Harlem. And their story is extraordinary. They fought and battled racism and segregation. And they fought separately in many cases under the French command, but very bravely and heroically in France. And Hamilton Fish wanted to honor his men. I mean, it's quite possible that the unknown soldier itself was one of his men. We don't know. But he wanted to honor his men, and also he really took up the cause of the unknown soldier. And he puts the bill through Congress, and President Wilson signs it. And ultimately, President Warren Harding, who's in office in 1921, moves forward with the ceremony and the construction of the tomb and the selection. And 4 bodies of unknown soldiers are selected in France from the great cemeteries in France, which were all places of incredible battle. This is like the Meuse-Argonne, for instance. Belleau Wood, there's a cemetery. Saint-Mihiel, where Saunders leads his charge across the no man's land, breaches the wire, and captures 63 Germans. In the Somme, and the unidentified are removed. And these 4 bodies, they're They're carefully checked to make sure there's no dog tags or letters or diaries or anything that can identify them. The actual burial certificates of where they were located are burned on the spot. So there's no way to actually identify which of these four came from where. And then they're brought back to Chalons, France, to the city hall in France. And there's an honor guard present of, battle-hardened grunts from France. France turns out, the country comes, and a general officer from the United States is ultimately given the responsibility, the awesome responsibility of choosing the unknown soldier. But at the last minute that night, the French said, we used an enlisted man who had gone through this hell to select our unknown soldier. And that night, Edward F. Younger from Chicago, from the 9th Infantry Regiment, who had one of the best records in terms of service and who had gone through, this incredible hell as a doughboy, was given the honor of selecting the unknown soldier. In that morning, he wakes up, realizes, the awesome responsibility that he has. The room itself is the city hall. There are 4 flag-draped caskets. The floor of the room is littered with white rose petals. Chopin is playing in the background. He passes through this French honor guard, goes into the room. He says he looks at the flag and he talks about how sublime it is. In the unknowns, I was able to find Edward Younger's handwritten notes on that experience, and they're in the book for the first time. And he, realizes the awesome responsibility. He prays. He kind of walks around. He's nervous. He doesn't have who to choose. And then all of a sudden, his hand is literally guided to the one casket. And he is absolutely convinced that it was somebody that he went over the top with, that he knows the man inside. And he places a bouquet of white flowers on top of the casket, and that is our unknown soldier.
Talk a little bit about your research on this project and really digging into this. And I think this is your first World War I book, and really about the process that you went through.
This is my first World War I book, and I started doing the research for this book in around 2010 or 11, and it was just on the side. I was beginning to collect the materials. And I really went completely immersive on this project. I started to collect the artifacts from World War I, the uniforms, the helmets, gas masks, everything. I sort of went into that time zone and really immersed myself fully into this period. And then I spent years at the National Archives and other archives just pulling out the original primary sources for this book. And it's extensively footnoted. Everything in here is generally primary source material. And it's in the words of those who were there, the participants, which is classic kind of the books that I've written. But it also puts you in their footsteps, in their boots in the trenches, or in this case, some cases on the ship itself, or the submarine. And yeah, it took me years to write the book, and it was a remarkable journey. And I think this is a forgotten generation. The reason why I wrote this book is because when I was at Belleau Wood, I realized that the generation of men that I was with in Fallujah were directly impacted by World War I. It was the former Ottoman Empire. And it was a realization that not only were we all impacted and almost killed by World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was carved up into artificial countries like Iraq, but it was also a realization that World War I generation is unknown. It's forgotten. And today's generation is almost the same. People have no idea about the service or sacrifice, and I wanted to tell the story of the unknown doughboy generation that had changed our world.
It's interesting that initially there was kind of pushback, and I think you touched on this earlier, pushback from the military to the idea of doing this.
There was a belief that the 2,200 Americans could be identified. And there was also pushback from a cost perspective. They didn't want to bring back the bodies of all 116,000 fallen who died in France. And the first step was that they decided to give families the opportunity to have their sons brought home. And about half of those Americans that had fallen in France were brought home. And then the next step was the unknowns themselves. And they initially believed that they could find or identify these men. And then the groundswell or the movement that was created by the editor of the Delineator, that changed that dynamic.
How has the monument evolved over the years with the incorporation of unknowns from other wars and really the way in which the monument became what it is today?
Initially, the monument was a very simple stone slab that was only about a foot above the ground. And in the 1930s, what we now see today is the Tomb of the Unknown was created. And initially, there was no tomb guards or sentinels there. The people could literally come to Arlington, and they could have a picnic, and it was horrendous. There was actually vandalism on the tomb itself. In the 1930s, it was decided to have a tomb guard that would guard the tomb 24 hours a day, 7 days a week under any weather conditions. And that's part of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, the Old Guard, which does that incredible honor every day. And I'm blessed that they are very, very strong supporters of the unknowns. And I'm very honored by their participation and interest. And as the tomb, over the years, there's an unknown from World War II in the tomb, as well as the Korean War. And there initially was an unknown from Vietnam that was placed in the tomb. But it was found later that, at the insistence of that family, this individual, who was an aviator, was identified through DNA analysis and was removed from the tomb and then given full military honors and is then later buried.
Given DNA today, given the way we're able to identify today, is this an idea that has passed us by?
No, I don't think so at all, because there's no certainty that the individual inside the tomb, especially from World War I, can be identified. There may not be it's probably highly unlikely that there's in the DNA base that we have now that he may be identified. There's a possibility of degradation. But the other thing is the tomb itself is an incredibly important memorial. It's a national symbol. It represents who we are as Americans. It also represents all who have served and all who have died for the United States under arms. And so I think that's the importance of the tomb.
Patrick O'Donnell, the book is The Unknowns, the untold story of America's unknown soldier and World War I's most decorated heroes who brought him home. Patrick, it is always a pleasure. I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah.
Appreciate it.